Bob found the treasure map inside a trash can. Not just any trash can. This one had a suspicious amount of old paper sticking out of it. Bob pulled out a battered envelope, shook off a banana peel, and unfolded the yellowed page. Across the top were 6 words. "Do not search for the treasure." Bob stared at it. Then he smiled. Finally! A challenge! At the bottom was another instruction. Find out why it was lost. Bob ignored that one too. Inside the envelope was an old coin. He held it toward the sunlight. A mysterious coin. A secret map. A warning. He grinned. This is obviously a treasure map. There was just one problem. A rival salvage crew had found the same claim. Their boat was already heading toward the marked location. Bob looked at their boat. Then at the map. Then back at the boat. I have 12 minutes to become extremely wealthy. He ran toward the coast. The map led him to a rocky shoreline overlooking the sea. According to the old record, a valuable cargo ship had disappeared somewhere nearby. Bob pointed at the water. Simple. The treasure is underwater. A wave crashed against the rocks. Bob nodded. Exactly as I predicted. The map showed the ship's final route. Bob followed it into a strange reconstruction of the past. Suddenly he was standing on the ship's deck. The sky was black. The sea was throwing waves over the rail. Cargo crates were sliding across the deck. Bob grabbed one. Don't worry! I've handled dangerous cargo before. A crate slammed into him. Not successfully. Another wave hit. The ship lurched sideways. Bob grabbed a second crate and tried dragging it toward the center. Then a third crate smashed into both of them. The deck tilted even farther. Bob looked toward the imaginary treasure chest beside him. Forget everything else. Save the chest. The next wave answered for him. The ship broke apart. Cargo spilled into the sea. Crates, coins, tools, containers, and valuables disappeared beneath the waves in different directions. Bob surfaced beside a floating barrel. He watched the wreck vanish. Then he looked at his map. The treasure has moved. That was not part of his plan. Bob followed the cargo underwater. The wreck was no longer one neat pile. Objects had separated. Some rolled across the seabed. Some became trapped between rocks. Others were carried away by currents. Then mud began covering them. Bob watched a shiny object disappear beneath the sediment. He grabbed it. More sediment fell over his hand. He dug it out again. More mud. Bob stared at the seabed. This treasure is aggressively trying to become lost. He abandoned the idea of finding one marked chest and followed the scattered cargo instead. But every object seemed to have taken a different path. The ship had sunk in one place. The cargo was somewhere else. And years of currents and sediment had made the original location almost useless. Bob finally understood his first mistake. A treasure didn't have to be hidden to become lost. It could simply be destroyed, scattered, buried, and separated from everything that once identified it. Bob climbed back onto the shore. Fine. He pointed at the map. Then humans are the problem. The next clue carried him into another reconstruction. This time, there was no storm. There was a town preparing for war. People were rushing through the streets carrying valuables. Someone hid coins beneath the floor. Another person stuffed jewelry behind a wall. Someone else packed valuables into a container and fled. Bob watched the town empty. Aha! He spotted one hiding place. This treasure stayed exactly where it was put. Bob proudly planted a marker beside it. Then the reconstruction jumped forward. Years passed. The building changed. The road changed. The property changed hands. The marker disappeared. Bob blinked. No! Another generation passed. The old building vanished. A new road crossed the area. Bob looked around. Okay. The treasure didn't move. He pointed at the ground. Everything else did. He followed the old records. One map used one place name. Another used a different name. A boundary had moved. A road had disappeared. A familiar building no longer existed. Bob tried placing the maps together. They didn't line up. He rotated one. Worse. He flipped it upside down. Perfect. It was not perfect. The hiding place had once been obvious to the person who created it. But centuries later, the same clue could point almost anywhere. Bob had discovered something worse than a missing treasure. A missing context. Someone could know exactly where they buried something, leave a perfectly good record, and still leave future generations unable to understand it. That sent Bob back to the original claim. He raced toward the marked location. This was the place. The legendary treasure site. Bob imagined a gigantic chest beneath his feet. He imagined gold. He imagined fame. He imagined himself buying a statue of himself holding another statue of himself. He took one step. Nothing happened. He took another. Still nothing. Bob searched the ground. Nothing. The rival salvage crew arrived. Their leader pointed at the map. The legend says the treasure is right here. Bob nodded. Yes. They waited. The ground remained completely unimpressed. Bob checked the records again. Then he noticed something. The records did not actually say the treasure was still there. They described what had happened to it. Some valuables had been recovered. Some had been moved. Some had been scattered. Some had been buried. And some had simply vanished from the record. Bob slowly lowered the map. The treasure wasn't one chest. The rival frowned. Bob pointed toward the sea. We've been searching for the wrong thing. That was the turning point. Bob no longer wanted to find a giant box. He wanted to find out what happened to the valuables after they were lost. He followed the trail again. This time, he wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for consequences. A storm scattered cargo. Bob watched objects separate from the wreck. A war forced people to hide valuables. Bob watched entire families flee without knowing whether they would ever return. A landscape changed. Roads, buildings, boundaries, and landmarks shifted until an old location became almost meaningless. Records disappeared or lost their context. And then the strangest thing happened. The stories grew. A missing shipment became a lost fortune. A handful of recovered objects became evidence of an enormous treasure. A forgotten hiding place became a secret cache. A complicated history became a much simpler story. There's a giant treasure somewhere. Bob stared at the growing collection of legends. So that's the trick. The rival crews suddenly shouted from the shore. They had found another supposed treasure location. And this one sounded even better. The legendary fortune was supposedly buried near the coast. The rival crew raced toward it. Bob followed, but for the first time, he wasn't chasing the legend. He was chasing the evidence. The rival crew reached the site and began digging. Bob looked at the shoreline. Then the old route. Then the currents. Then the historical records. He noticed something. If the cargo had been lost where the legend claimed, the surviving objects should not be concentrated there. The currents would have carried them elsewhere. If sediment had buried them, the likely surviving material would be farther along the seabed. And if part of the cargo had already been recovered, the records should leave traces of it. Bob pointed toward a smaller area. The treasure isn't there. The rival leader shouted. Then where is it? Bob smiled. That's the right question. He traced the object's possible journey. Loss. Scattering. Movement. Burial. Recovery. Missing information. Legend. The giant chest in the story had become a chain of events. Bob followed the chain to its most defensible surviving point. They searched. Nothing. Bob swallowed. His theory had become reasonable. That usually meant disaster was coming. Then someone shouted. They had found something. Bob rushed over. It wasn't a chest. It wasn't a mountain of gold. It was one small artifact. Bob picked it up. His eyes widened. This, he held it above his head, is the greatest treasure in human history. Everyone stared at him. Bob lowered it. Or possibly the smallest. But the object mattered. It matched the historical trail. The treasure had existed. The legend wasn't completely invented. It had simply grown far larger than the evidence could support. Bob looked back toward the empty legendary site. Now he understood why there are so many lost treasures. Not because the world is filled with people who bury giant chests and immediately forgot where they put them. Sometimes a ship sinks and scatters valuable cargo across the seabed. Sometimes people hide valuables during war and never return. Sometimes buildings disappear, rivers shift, coastlines change, or sediment buries what was once easy to find. Sometimes the object survives but the record doesn't. And sometimes the record survives while the meaning disappears. Then generations pass. Someone remembers that something valuable was lost. Another person tells the story. The story becomes simpler. Then bigger. Eventually, a messy chain of events becomes one perfect image. A giant treasure chest, waiting to be found. Bob looked at his original map. It was now covered with arrows. Storm. War. Burial. Movement. Changing landscapes. Missing records. Legend. He smiled. So the real treasure. He paused. Was terrible record-keeping. The rival crew groaned. Bob nodded proudly. Finally. A mystery I can profit from. He held up the map. I'm selling this. The rivals stared at it. It's covered in arrows. Bob grinned. Exactly. He had not recovered the enormous fortune he wanted. He had something smaller. Something real. More importantly, he had reconstructed how a real treasure could disappear without anyone ever deliberately hiding a giant chest. That was the real mystery. Treasure can be lost in one moment. But it can become truly lost through dozens of small events afterward. A storm scatters it. People abandon it. The ground buries it. The landscape changes. The records fade. And the legend fills in the gaps. Bob looked at the tiny artifact in his hand. He had wanted a fortune. Instead, he had found proof. He smiled. Then he quietly looked back at the map. Still. He pointed at one unexplained arrow. That one could definitely mean there's a chest. And before anyone could stop him, Bob ran after it.
That's it for this mystery. Subscribe for more adventures with Bob, and watch the next video on screen.